We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. The government of Bashar Al-Assad, the Syrian government, has been toppled. In the last 3 days, Israel has destroyed Syria's army and naval facilities. Israel has carried out more than 480 military strikes on Syria during that time. The United States government has worked for the last 15 years to topple the government of Syria. Today, we're going to talk about Syria, the Middle East, what comes next, and of course, what comes next for the people of Gaza. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today, we're talking with Layan Sima Fuleihan. She is a Palestinian organizer, a popular educator, and the education director at the People's Forum. Layan, welcome back.
It's great to be back, Brian.
Layan, everything has changed, and it's been very dramatic, very rapid. We have a lot to talk about. I want to talk about the situation on the ground in Syria, what's happening. Of course, there are big crowds celebrating the fall of the old Syrian government, the Assad government. And yet there are, at the same time, large numbers of people who are very scared. There are massacres going on. There are executions. The Israeli government is taking advantage of the moment to strike Syrian naval and army facilities. As a matter of fact, Netanyahu claimed credit for the toppling of the Syrian government. As I said in the introduction, the U.S. has been trying to topple this government for 15 years. Anyway, we have a lot to talk about, and I also want to put it into the context of the history of Syria, the history of the Middle East. It's a long drama, a long saga, an important struggle, a struggle that has implications not only for the Arab people, the peoples of the Middle East, but for global politics. Anyway, let's talk about how the Palestinian movement is reacting to the last developments.
Well, Brian, of course, every Palestinian, all the Palestinian factions, every part of Palestinian society has been watching very closely the developments in Syria, not just because of this is a major world development, but because what happens in Syria is going to have huge impacts on the course of the struggle for Palestinian liberation and the conditions of the Palestinian people. The Assad government, for all of its contradictions, actually had governed over a Syria that was a major player in the so-called axis of resistance. Iran had relations with Syria. Hezbollah had relations in Syria. It also was the headquarters of many of the Palestinian factions. It was a route for the transport of weapons, materials, between different resistance factions across the region. And now the developments have occurred very rapidly. The fall of the Assad government happened extremely quickly. We don't know what kinds of deals happened behind the scenes to kind of facilitate this. We do know that the rebel groups very quickly took control of one city after another until reaching Damascus.
Well, let me ask you, it appeared that the Syrian Arab Army, the national army of Syria, the army that had basically defeated many of these same rebel forces 15 years ago, 10 years ago, an army that lost 150,000 soldiers in that fight. This time they didn't fight. I mean, Syria has been bombed routinely by Israel. It's been under extreme economic sanctions, huge economic losses. The government itself pursued a neoliberal economic program. It felt to me like the resistance inside of Syria against these U.S.-backed, Turkish-backed, earlier Saudi-backed rebels, that will to fight vanished. And I mean, in any war, if the will to fight ends on one side, for whatever reason, the wars come to an end quickly. The rebels weren't that formidable, but the Syrian Arab army didn't fight. I mean, Iran, which was an ally of Bashar Al-Assad, talked about that in a way they were critical of the Assad government. The Assad government, according to the Iranian sources, said that Assad himself was complaining about the lack of will to fight. Anyway, it's been such a long, protracted struggle. and you can see that the Syrian government has been sort of basically weakened in core ways. I just wonder, have the Palestinian groups have come together, the different factions, they've issued a statement. Let's hear the statement. I want to hear what the Palestinian groups are saying, because many of them had been based at one time or another in Damascus.
Yes, Brian, that's true. So the Palestinian factions that are present in Syria came together. They released a statement. They released a statement as the Joint Palestinian National Action Authority, which is a body that is not as active as it used to be in the past, but it still does issue statements at critical moments. It includes every Palestinian faction, from the left to Fatah to the Islamic factions. And what they said here, and I'm reading from a quick translation here, they said that they reaffirm the support for the brotherly Syrian people in their right to self-determination and to build their independent national state on all Syrian national soil. They also stressed the need to strengthen the bonds of brotherhood between the Syrian and Palestinian peoples and to meet in a common destiny to confront the one enemy in Syria and Palestine which has not ceased to commit its heinous crimes against our people and our nation, meaning, of course, the Israelis. And they also affirmed that the Palestinian refugee camps and their gatherings throughout Syria will be only a support for the Syrian people in shaping the future.
All right, so you can see from that statement that they're emphasizing Syrian self-determination, that Israel should be forced out, that Israel's strikes against Syria are a fundamental threat to Syrian sovereignty. They're sort of staying out of the question of what the next step will be inside of Syria. And perhaps no one knows yet, but HTS, the rebel force that took the government, that led the charge against the government and then proclaimed itself, at least on an interim basis, to be the government or part of the government. Now, the U.S. labeled them as a terrorist organization. They have long links to Al-Qaeda. And certainly the Palestinian resistance has distanced itself completely from Al-Qaeda, has considered Al-Qaeda like an enemy in the past. But again, perhaps no one knows what the real nature of the new Syrian government is, because there are so many forces at play. There's, of course, the internal dynamic inside of Syria. There's Turkey, and Turkey was a sponsor of HTS and the other forces, the rebel forces that, after they had been defeated earlier in the war, were given safe transit to Idlib province in the northwest part of Syria. But then there are other political forces, including secular forces, including forces who may have been opposed to the Assad government, even from a progressive direction, from the left. Anyway, it's an unknown right now, but the U.S. seems to be cautiously presenting about Syria, but the U.S. is happy that Assad is gone.
Definitely. The U.S. is thrilled that Assad is gone. Like you said in the opening, Brian, they've been working for over 15 years to get the Assad government to go away. And it's not quite clear exactly, like you said, we don't know for sure the course of the new Syrian government and what it's going to take. But we do know a few things. One, HTS is positioned itself as the head of the transitional government for at least the next 3 months. They haven't stated what would come after the next 3 months. And we know that HTS full name is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which means the liberation of the Levant. And
They're Al-Qaeda, historically.
They're a renamed Nusra Front, which is the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. Ahmed al-Shara, who also known as al-Jalani, but he changed his name to al-Jalani as when he was a leader of the Nusra Front. And
he's the current leader of HTS.
Yes, and he recently changed his name back to al-Shara. He's indicating that they're going to do kind of like what the Taliban did in Afghanistan. During the moment of conflict, they were extremely Islamic in the way they expressed themselves and the way they organized things. And then when they became a state power, they started to try to shed some of that in their identification. This is probably what's happening in terms of HTS right now. They are moving from a rebel Islamist group to now taking responsibility for managing the state. They have not said exactly what the state is going to look like, but they have made a few indications. One, they have announced that they're moving from a state-run economy to a free market economy.
So straight out capitalism.
Yes. How that's going to work, the transition, we're not quite sure. They also, in the first comments to Western media so far, Al-Jalani or Shara said that the country is not ready for another war. No one should be nervous in the West about HTS or about Syria waging a new war.
Meaning a confrontation with Israel.
That's what it would mean. He then clarified and said that the source of the problem was the Iranian militias, Hezbollah, and the Assad regime, which is responsible for the massacres being carried out today.
HTS, Jolani, is targeting Hezbollah, inferring that it's not Israel. In other words, sending a message to the U.S. Look, you characterized us officially as a terrorist entity, characterized him as a terrorist, foreign terrorist. The U.S., according to the Wall Street Journal, is now reconsidering that designation, but sending a signal to Washington, look, we're going to pursue a pro-Western agenda. I mean, in essence, that's what HTS is signaling right now, correct?
Correct. I mean, and they've made no complaint. They've showed no resistance to the massive Israeli incursion on Syrian territory.
I don't think they've even protested against it.
No, nothing that we can see. And Brian, something that's really important to note, too, is that the media coming out of Syria is vast. A lot of it is coming out on social media. There was also a lot of false media being propagated through capitalist media outlets over the past couple of weeks. It can be really hard to know exactly what's going on in Syria. If you were actually going to go to any major media site over the past 10 days, I mean, you would basically think that it was a popular uprising that overthrew the Assad government. They were depicting the rebel groups as basically as like very friendly, very popular, supported groups. Al-Jalani appeared in CNN for an interview. He had a sit-down with the New York Times. Remember that this is designated by the United States and by European countries as a terrorist with a $10 million bounty on his head, but he had these great interview opportunities. It's kind of rare.
The irony here, just for everyone, the irony is quite remarkable. When the September 11th, 2001 attacks happened, thousands of people died at the World Trade Center and more at the Pentagon. That was Al-Qaeda, right? That was Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda. The U.S. said that the Taliban in Afghanistan, who were not Al-Qaeda, they were a right-wing Islamic grouping, but they had given host status to the Al-Qaeda. So the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and was in Afghanistan for 20 years in the war against terror, in the fight against Al-Qaeda. And now you have an Al-Qaeda government taking office, at least in the transitional sense, or for the transitional period in Syria, and the U.S. is like, no, this is cool. Jake Sullivan, who is now the national security advisor to Biden, but was earlier a State Department official when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, he sent a telegram. This was back in 2012 when the war was really in its early stages. The U.S., Turkey, Saudi Arabia backing these rebel forces against the Assad government. He sent a cable to Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, and said, we're on AQ's side. AQ is Al-Qaeda. This came out from WikiLeaks. This was like 12 years ago. So the U.S. is like, we have to go to war against terror. We have to go to war against Al-Qaeda. We're going to invade Afghanistan because they gave comfort to Al-Qaeda. But in Syria, the U.S. is on the side of Al-Qaeda. And now you have HTS, the new government, which is a chain. It's Al-Qaeda with a new name. And the U.S. is cool with it.
Yeah, it seems like it's the playbook of the way the United States has been operating in the region over the past couple of decades. Just for more background information, Jalani was imprisoned by the United States in Iraq for 5 years. He was released, and then he went to Syria and became a leader of the Nusra Front there. So it begs one to wonder what happened in the prison, what his role was in Syria. HTS, the sources of backing of HTS are relatively vague and unclear, but there's credible reporting that Turkey does have some major amount of funding of HTS, whether it's
Turkey
direct or
controlled
indirect.
Idlib province, basically.
Yes.
And that's where HTS was.
Exactly. So they facilitated the leadership of HTS over Idlib. And Turkey, let's remember, is a NATO state, despite some of the sometimes anti-Western statements of Erdogan, the head of the AKP government. There's also been reports that HTS has received funding from the Israelis in the past. Now, the whole thing is still foggy. Like you said, the rapid fall of the Assad government was also combined with the fact that the Syrian Arab army did not put up a big fight. A lot of the reports coming from the Syrian state news agency during the rebel offensive was the Syrian forces have strategically redeployed or strategically are repositioning themselves outside of certain territories. We don't know exactly what happened for sure, but there definitely was collaboration from Turkey, from the United States, from Israel behind the scenes during the week.
And it seems like the Syrian army is a conscripted army. Meaning have been drafted. Young people have been drafted. Syria is also a class society. It's divided between rich and poor. It's a class society. It has a bourgeoisie, it has a working class, it has a peasantry. Most of the conscripts obviously are going to come from the working class and the peasantry because that's the majority of the country. Now, they are in a situation where they have to be led by officers. There's a lot of reports that the officer corps basically fled, that when the HTS was starting its offensive, that they just took off. Now, again, there's going to be a lot more that will come out. Why did they leave? Were they bribed? Had they already been on the payroll of somebody? We don't know. Or did they just lose the will to fight? We're not in a position, Layan, of saying the Assad government was the greatest thing since sliced bread. In fact, it's a corrupt government. It has, as I said, a government when it's a class-driven society, rich and poor, bourgeoisie and working class. The government represents bourgeois forces, elite forces. There's a lot of wealth at one end and a lot of suffering at the other end. And undoubtedly corruption. You can see some of the stories. So the Syrian people could have lots of reasons of wanting to get rid of the old government. One, they might think, okay, now sanctions will end. Two, they might think, well, that's a corrupt government, and let's get a better government. There's always a sort of a sense of hopefulness if there's a big change coming. The Assad family, because before Bashar Al-Assad was the president, his father was the president, and they took power in a coup in 1963 against an even more left-wing government. So they've been in power for 50-plus years. So just the idea of like having change. So there's lots of reasons why people might be celebrating, but that doesn't mean that the Syrian people want to live under HTS. That doesn't mean that the Syrian people want to live under an extreme Islamic government or a pro-imperialist government. In fact, when you look at the history of Syria, it had a very strong left wing, a very strong communist movement, and perhaps the secular nature of Syria was more pronounced, more developed than anywhere in the Middle East, meaning it's a predominantly Muslim country, but there's Christians, there's other both religious minorities and ethnic minorities. The Syrian Ba'athist government, for whatever its failings, had a very sort of welcoming position. So, for instance, Christian communities or the Alawite Muslims, who are a minority religion, they felt protected by the Assad government. Anyway, this is complicated, and of course, we don't know what comes next, but the U.S. is going to always look at this from a geostrategic point of view. I want to play a clip. Sure. I have a number of clips, in fact. The first one is going to be Donald Trump, because Obama sent American troops into Syria in order to fight ISIS, the Islamic State, right? And that Islamic State grew up in Iraq and then in Syria after the U.S. had invaded Iraq and demolished the old Iraqi Ba'athist government, which was also a secular government. And they destroyed the Ba'athist army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers who could no longer work, couldn't get paid. They became sort of the human materiel for ISIS, the rise of this really fanatical right-wing Islamic force. So the U.S. invades Iraq and also sends troops to Syria in the name of fighting ISIS. Okay, then ISIS is defeated not really because of the U.S., but because of resistance forces in Iraq, in Syria, the Iranian forces, Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general who Trump executed at the Baghdad airport, he was leading the fight against ISIS, and of course Hezbollah, and of course the Syrian Arab Army, who lost 125,000. All right, all of that happened. Then Donald Trump becomes president of the United States in 2017, and the fighting basically dies down. ISIS is defeated. I want to play a clip from Donald Trump, and he's talking about why the U.S. kept troops in northeastern Syria after ISIS was defeated, and after al-Qaeda has been also defeated and sent to Idlib province. Let's watch.
And then they say he left troops in Syria. You know what I did? I left troops to take the oil. I took the oil. The only troops I have are taking the oil. They're protecting the oil. I took over
We're taking the oil. We're not taking the oil.
Well, maybe we will. Maybe we won't.
They're protecting the facility.
I don't know. Maybe we should take it. But we have the oil. Right now, the United States has the oil. So they say he left troops in Syria. No, I got rid of all of them other than we're protecting the oil. We have the oil.
Yeah, they want the oil. I mean, the thing about Trump is he's very straightforward. The rest of the imperialist politicians camouflage their imperialist designs with sort of noble-sounding goals, but for Trump, it's like, no, we want the oil.
Well, interestingly, Trump put out a tweet in the midst of the fall of the Assad government recently, and he said, this is a big mess. It is because of Biden. It's a huge mess. This is terrible. We should have nothing to do with it. We should get out of Syria, in all caps, at the bottom of his tweet. I mean, is that really what he's going to do, Brian? I'm not sure, because the part of Syria that the United States has its troops in, the majority of its troops, is the oil-rich region. He said right there in the clip, a perfect expose of what the U.S. agenda is in Syria and in the entire region overall. They're there for the oil. And they're continuing to work very closely with the Kurdish forces that are controlling the region where is the majority of the oil is located.
The northeast part of Syria, where the oil fields are.
Exactly. And by the way, Brian, in 2011, the U.S. placed another round of major sanctions. Syria had been under U.S. sanctions since 1989, but with increasing as time went on. But in 2011, the U.S. put major sanctions that effectively created an embargo on the entire oil sector of the Syrian economy.
We have another clip. This is Wesley Clark. Wesley Clark was the U.S. general who led NATO during the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999. The U.S., Britain, France, the other NATO powers destroyed Yugoslavia. And Wesley Clark was talking later in media interviews. This was in after 2001. He was talking about he went to the Pentagon after September 11th, about a week or two later, and he was told that the U.S. was going to invade Iraq. And he said, why are we going to invade Iraq? And the person he's talking to was a former high officer in the Pentagon, said, I don't know. And then he came back a week later and he says, are we still invading Iraq? And the guy says, oh, it's much worse than that. We're going to invade 7 countries. We're going to topple 7 countries. Anyway, let's listen to this Wesley Clark clip, and then I want to get your thoughts.
And he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon, and one of the generals called me in. He said, sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second. I said, well, you're too busy. He said, no. He says, we've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq. This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, we're going to war with Iraq. Why? He said, I don't know. He said, I guess they don't know what else to do. So I said, well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to al-Qaeda? He said, no. He says, there's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq. He said, I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments. And he said, I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, And by that time, we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today. And he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
7 countries. Who are those countries? Iraq, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Somalia, and then Iran. Well, that was 20 years ago, Layan. And like a lot of times people look at a situation in Syria and say, look, there's a dictator and it's corrupt and the people want change. And that might be true. That might be true. You don't have to, people have all kinds of different positions about the Assad government. And the Assad government itself has gone through many stages and phases. You know, in a 50-year rule of father and son, it went from a very left-wing government to becoming a neoliberal government. So you can have all kinds of different views on it. But if you step back and you think about Syria not simply as what's going on in Syria, but what's going on in the region. What about the Israeli bombing of the country relentlessly? Right. What about economic sanctions? What about General Wesley Clark? He's not a radical, he's not a communist, he's not a Marxist, he's not a socialist. He is a Pentagon general and he is an imperialist. He's telling the truth about the thinking of the George W. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell government way back when. And he said, we're going to take out these governments. Those governments have been taken out, with the exception of Iran. I think all the rest of them are basically, there's been regime change somewhere in that. So let's look at the big picture, everybody, that what's happening inside of Syria is part and parcel also of global politics.
Definitely. We have a recent example, actually, that completely underscores this reality. The U.S. and its allies have had a plan to so-called reshape the Middle East in a way that's more beneficial to the agenda of U.S. imperialism, a way to organize the Middle East in which the U.S. would have no obstacles to achieving any of the resources that the region has, in particular oil, and for maintaining political authority over the economy of the region. On October 8, 2023, right after the major offensive launched by the Palestinian resistance against Israel that took Israel by surprise, that shocked the entire world, that made a lot of people suddenly feel that Palestinian resistance was active, that the struggle was an active struggle. On October 8, Gallant, the Minister of Defense at the time, he's since then been dismissed, he said, of Israel, he said, we need to go to Lebanon now. That it's not Gaza that is the priority for the Israelis, even though from Gaza had been launched a major attack that Israel had not seen in quite some time. And he said, no, we have to go to Lebanon, indicating we didn't fully understand it at the time, but it's come out since then, and we've seen it now displayed in Israel's attacks on Lebanon that came in phases that were brutal, that clearly had been planned for over a decade. That, in fact, Israel had a project to go against the anti-Zionist, the resistance forces in the region, and they did not want to be distracted by that project. It was Netanyahu who, fighting to stay in power, fighting against the corruption cases that were being levied against him, that wanted to have more of a state of urgent war
on Gaza.
That said, no, we need to prioritize fighting against Gaza right now. They didn't just fight, they've been decimating Gaza. And Gallant and those around him, the military establishment, had been struggling against Netanyahu to go to Lebanon. They wanted to go to Lebanon to take out Hezbollah. They had a plan to so-called reshape the Middle East, take out their opponents in full collaboration with the United States. Everything Israel does is in full collaboration.
Okay, let's stick with this a little bit, because when Gallant and the Israeli military are saying, let's go to Lebanon, They know that in Lebanon is a country. It's not like Gaza, which is an occupied territory, which is small. It's actually a very small strip of land. Lebanon, a small country, but way bigger than Gaza. And the Lebanese resistance forces, Hezbollah, is way stronger militarily than Hamas in Gaza or the other Palestinian resistance forces.
And even so strong that it was really Hezbollah that defended the Syrian government from the rebel offensives in the past. It was without Hezbollah's help, they would not have been able to defeat the rebels.
And also, this is another interesting feature of it. The rebel forces in Syria were largely dominated by Al-Qaeda and also ISIS. There was a non-Islamic opposition to the Assad government too, but that opposition said, we want to change the Syrian government, but we don't want to collaborate with foreign military forces. We don't want to collaborate with Turkey or Saudi Arabia or the United States. So there was two oppositions, right? So the opposition that was basically dominant was the Islamic opposition at that time. Now, Hezbollah is also a Muslim movement. It's an Islamic movement. But unlike Al-Qaeda, it isn't part of a super reactionary pro-imperialist agenda, where with Al-Qaeda, even with the September 11th, 2001 attacks, which is kind of blowback for American military forces occupying Saudi Arabia, the land of Mecca and Medina, which Osama bin Laden focused on. And again, that part of Saudi Arabia was occupied after the first Gulf War, where the U.S. dropped 120,000 tons of bombs on Iraq. So Hezbollah is also a religious movement, but it's an anti-imperialist religious movement. That's not true about HTS. That's not true about Al-Qaeda.
I'm glad you said that, Brian, because the distinction here actually at its core isn't between Islamist or secular organizations. These are forms of organization that people decide based on needs, based on political agendas, based on many different things. The difference here is exactly what you said. There are groups like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, like Nusra, that are not simply just Islamist movements. They are extreme fundamentalist movements that at their core have the same vision, for their visions align with the interests of the United States.
And with Israel. Israel has never fought against ISIS. They never fought against Al-Qaeda. They don't seem bothered by this wing of an Islamic movement coming to power. They seem perfectly content with it.
I mean, there's been multiple statements from individuals representing Nusra and representing HTS over the years, where they have indicated that they believe Israel is a good thing, that they want to have friends with the Israeli state, that they respect the Israeli state. When they plan the conquering of the Arab region, it doesn't include Israel. The United States.
They wanted to conquer Syria and Iraq, but not historic Palestine, because that's Israel's.
Exactly. And the United States went into Syria, like we've already discussed, saying that they're there to fight ISIS, and they demonized Islam. The United States went into a huge demonization campaign of Islam as a religion, in a way to demonize the people of the entire region, to justify waging war, not against particular groups in Iraq, against the entire Iraqi population, against the entire Syrian population. They went into Syria saying they're going to defeat ISIS. But like you said, who defeated ISIS? It wasn't the United States with their military might, which they can do whatever they want to do. I mean, they have the most weapons, the most wealth in the entire world. It was actually the resistance forces, a major section of that being Hezbollah, which is operating with an Islamic ideology. Hamas, also an Islamic ideology. These are not groups that are backed by imperialism, nor are they groups that impose extreme forms of social regulation that will end up in the kinds of atrocities that we saw in Idlib, that we saw Al-Qaeda carry out, and that there are reports have been occurring now in the aftermath of the fall.
People in Syria right now are getting beheaded and massacred by this wing of political Islam, meaning a very right-wing, pro-imperialist wing, taking retribution or just identifying people who don't conform to whatever their regulations are. All right, I want to play some other clips. And again, we want to put what's going on in Syria internally, recognizing that people inside of Syria, meaning the Syrian people, who are a very diverse people. There's different religious organizations, different religious communities. There's Shiite, there's Sunni. There are a substantial Christian community, also other ethnic minorities. The U.S. media is only focusing on those who are celebrating right now. They're not focusing on the people who are being beheaded, or people who are running for their lives. So the media impression that one gets is like all of Syria is united now and happy. Okay, maybe a lot of people are happy, but why is the U.S. happy? Now, this goes back to the historicality of our analysis. I want to play some more clips. This is George W. Bush talking about the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, at that time, they didn't say it was to rescue Iraqis from the Saddam dictatorship, even though they said Saddam was a dictatorship. They said it was to stop weapons of mass destruction that threaten the region. That was a lie. Anybody who had followed Iraq closely knew it was a lie. They knew it was a lie. It wasn't like an intelligence failure. It was a lie. And 1 million Iraqis died, and thousands of American soldiers died or had life-changing injuries because of these lies. Here's George W. Bush on, I think it is March 19th, 2003, at the beginning of the invasion of Iraq. Again, based on a lie.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
All right, so Layan, he's saying to the American people, yeah, you were out, and millions of people. The Answer Coalition was one of the major anti-war groups. We were organizing protests of hundreds of thousands of people every month to stop the war before it started. But he's telling people on March 19th, we're here to stop the threat posed by Iraq. There was no threat. That was a lie. I want to play another news clip from that same day. It's from an independent media source. The U.S. called the invasion of Iraq shock and awe. What does that mean? That means we're going to shock them. We're going to awe them. That's how the slave owners talked about enslaved people in South Carolina. That was an actual formulation used by slave owners. They're going to awe the slaves with terror so that the slaves wouldn't revolt. Anyway, here's what Baghdad looked like March 19th. The Iraqis had done nothing to the Americans. Here it is.
Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth. An inferno. ITV News cameras recorded the barrage from hotel balconies, and it was a truly chilling sight. Cruise missiles and bombs brought tons of high explosive to the heart of Baghdad's administrative district. This was about demolishing Saddam Hussein's symbols of power. They also hit at least one of his presidential palaces.
Iraq did nothing to the Americans. You look at that and you think, like, this is the worst brazen aggression. They say in the ITV coverage they're hitting symbols of Saddam's power. That's also called downtown Baghdad. That's downtown Baghdad. That's where people live. And also the U.S. destroyed their water system, the sewage system. There had been 14 years of sanctions, so the Iraqis couldn't even buy medicine. I went to Iraq multiple times during that time period. The first time I went to Iraq was right before the war started, and Iraq was an affluent country by Middle East standards. It had already been destroyed by 2003. So I want people to remember this when you hear American government officials telling you that they care about Syrians, that they care about democracy, that they don't want the Arab people to live under dictatorship. We have to remember this.
I mean, Brian, this is terrorism. The shock and awe method, that's terrorism. That's the definition of terrorism. It's to commit acts of such extreme violence that it terrifies the population into accepting whatever conditions the occupying or invading force is imposing on them. Look what happened in Gaza. This is terrorism. The entire Gaza territory, in its majority, houses, hospitals, every single university, every single religious center, every single mosque, every single person who's organizing the distribution of aid to the people who are seeking aid. Assassinations, over 100 assassinations inside of a hospital in northern Gaza recently. There's nothing left to bomb at this point. This is terrorism. It's not intended to hit just Hamas or intended to just put some pressure to release hostages. The only time the hostages were released was through negotiation. It's intended to scare the Palestinian people out of resisting, which obviously hasn't worked. It didn't work in Iraq either. Iraq has been part of the resistance movement since then until now against U.S. and Israeli designs for the region. It hasn't worked, but we have to call it by what it is. This is absolute terrorism. And I want to say one more thing. Look at how the United States, if we need one more example, look at how the United States reported on the pager attacks against the Lebanese people. They said it was technological superiority. They said it was amazing.
Like the Israelis actually put explosives in 5,000 pagers. And they did that months ago, back when Gallant was saying we have to turn to Lebanon. That's around the time that this all happened. So it wasn't like within a week or two of that attack. So they had planned a terrorist attack. I mean, there were doctors and nurses. What about, let's say you're in a Hezbollah militant, you're part of the Hezbollah military, and you're in the grocery store, and who's with you? Your wife is with you, your children, and your thing blows up. I mean, and the U.S. media says, oh, that showed real technological prowess. That was a tactical victory, but was it a strategic, did it have strategic value? That was the nature of the U.S. media. And now we can see from the beginning, with the U.S. support, with billions and billions of dollars, the U.S. wanted the Israelis to destroy Gaza. The U.S. wanted the Israelis to destroy resistance in Lebanon. And the U.S. wanted the Israelis to be able to destroy big parts of Syria, weaken Syria, such that the Syrian government, with whatever its flaws, would be toppled. I mean, again, you go to Iraq, you don't have to like Saddam Hussein. You can acknowledge that Saddam Hussein was a dictator. You can say all that, and you can still say, does that give U.S. imperialism the right to make up pretexts and carry out these savage attacks against a whole people? And can't you also understand that there's a geostrategic imperialist mode of driving that?
Exactly. And, you know, the United States, the capitalist media, they're going to talk about what's happening in Syria like it's a short-lived conflict and like it's purely a pro or anti-Assad question, when that's actually not the case at all. There was a popular uprising against Assad. That was actually a legitimate popular uprising
in 2011,
and that was not represented by these rebel armed forces that have toppled the Assad regime. What happened? The United States cultivated these rebel groups. The United States, Turkey, and others, they took advantage of a moment of vulnerability, and they took over the popular uprising. Is it that the United States' major sanctions regime against the Syrian government, did that create conditions for people to have a popular uprising and a reshaping of the form of government inside of Syria? No, it closed off major avenues for social and political struggle. It actually created the conditions for the Assad government to become a defensive government, to have to close down avenues of democracy and participation. I'm not saying that's all because of sanctions, but you cannot deny the fact that major attacks and attempts at intervention and sanctions create a condition in which the government has to be focused on defending itself against outside attacks. It doesn't create more avenues for people to exercise their self-determination, for leftists to build a leftist movement, for anyone to build any kind of movement. It closes off those avenues. On top of it, major mass displacement of Syrian people due to both the conflicts, the military violence, as well as the sanctions regime that was imposed on Syria. There's no sanctions regime that ever just targets the government or certain individuals. The entire population is impacted. There's been so many Syrian people who've been forced to flee, cross the Mediterranean, have lost their lives in the Mediterranean. The Syrian people have gone through many extremely traumatic experiences from all sides.
You know, every country has political polarization. Like, look at the United States, for instance. I mean, Trump supporters, they won the election this time. They narrowly lost the election last time. The United States is a very divided country, right? There's pro-Trump supporters and people who are very opposed to Trump. And there's other divisions, too. So having divided opinion in a country is not that novel. Matter of fact, it's pretty routine. So you could go into Syria, you could go into Iraq, you could go anywhere, in fact, and say society has divided opinion. If the U.S. media only wanted to focus on one side of that dispute, then you can make it look like the whole country is of one mind, when we know, in fact, that the population is divided. Now, I'm saying that because the U.S. also went to war against the Gaddafi government in Libya. So you had General Wesley Clark saying they're going to take out 7 countries, Iraq, Syria, the resistance forces in Lebanon, also Libya, and others. Now, in 2011, at the same time as the Arab Spring was spreading and led to those massive protests that brought down the Mubarak dictatorship in Egypt, there were protests in Syria, protests in Libya. There were protests all over the Arab world against the existing governments. And as you said, the U.S. took advantage of the protests in Syria that started off as a popular protest and basically co-opted it, and actually right-wing forces took control of that. Okay. In Libya is a small country. It's a big country, landmass, but a small population. Some people live in Tripoli and in the west, and other people lived in Benghazi in the east. So there was regional differences. At the time of the Arab Spring, there were protests in Benghazi in the east against the Gaddafi government. Now, just to help people understand what's important about Libya, Libya was so poor before the Libyan revolution led by Gaddafi that the leading source of economic activity was collecting scrap metal from Italian tanks that was left over from World War II. That's how poor the country was. By the time Gaddafi was toppled in 2011, as a result of a NATO bombing, Britain, France, and the United States, Libya had the highest living standard in Africa, with the exception perhaps of South Africa. Libya also had the largest oil reserves in Africa. Libya had free health care. Libya had free education. The social programs in Libya were vast. And again, you might not like Gaddafi. Divided opinion in any society, undoubtedly divided opinion in Libya, but this was the reality. Now, the U.S. started a bombing of Libya on the pretext that it was helping to protect the civilians in Benghazi. So the U.S. bombed and bombed and bombed and bombed, and then at the end, Gaddafi was driven from power, 70-year-old head of state, and these right-wing Al-Qaeda-like forces literally lynched him in the streets. I want to play a clip from Hillary Clinton. That day, the day this head of state was lynched following months of bombing by the United States, Britain, and France. And again, I want people to remember it, because when you hear Bush and you hear Hillary Clinton and you hear these other U.S. government officials, don't ever think that they're motivated by genuinely good causes like freedom or democracy or protecting us from weapons of mass destruction. Let's listen to Hillary Clinton.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
We came, we saw, he died. These are monsters. These are monsters.
Absolute monsters, Brian. And, you know, I think we need to continuously revisit this part of history, because I think what happened in Libya also opened a chapter in the consciousness of people inside the United States, in which the question of whether U.S. intervention is a good force or a bad force. Now, Brian, bombing a people, bombing a country, how does that ever lead to anything good? But because Gaddafi was so demonized in the U.S. media, because the polarization of the country was exploited to, like you said, made it seem like all of the Libyan people were united in their one and only desire was to get rid of Gaddafi, and that anything the United States could do would be something answering their calls. This seeped into the consciousness of people inside the United States as well. It was up for debate. I remember at the time people saying, well, intervention is an obligation of a country like the United States. We must intervene in order to help the oppressed people of the world who are being oppressed by these regimes. And this became a refrain. I mean, this is now what's happening in the narrative. It's been happening in the narrative around Assad, that Assad is so evil. Assad is pure evil. He's so evil that the United States must intervene. And in fact, people criticized Obama for not intervening enough. And this is a moral obligation of the United States as the benevolent force across the world. Now, that's clearly the United States is not a benevolent force across the world. If people have paid attention to the genocide in Gaza, the United States is enacting a genocide, and the toppling of the Syrian government, the toppling of the Libyan government, while every government has its contradictions, the toppling of Gaddafi has not led to more democracy, to more freedom for the Libyan people. Quite the contrary.
It led to slavery. The reinstitution of slavery, forms of slavery in Libya, especially for black Libyans or sub-Saharan Africans who had migrated for work to Libya. So we've covered George W. Bush, and we've covered Hillary Clinton. We covered Donald Trump saying we want the oil. Trump. The only difference between them is Trump is talking like the 19th century imperialists, where they talk like we want to take all of Haiti's wealth because we can. We want to take the Dominican Republic's wealth because we can. We want to take it from Venezuela because we can. We want to take it from China. We want to take it from India. We want to take it from everywhere because we can. Nowadays, in the modern era, they have to say they're doing it for a good cause. Humanitarian imperialism, which is what you're saying, like this is the new line. The line is American imperialism, unlike the old days where it just went in to plunder, loot, and pillage the resources of the colonized people, now it's doing it for their good. It's doing it to help. It's doing it to keep the world safe. Again, since we've covered those three, I want to go to Obama himself. This is back in 2011. This was at the time when Jake Sullivan was telling Hillary Clinton, who was Obama's Secretary of State, that Al-Qaeda was on our side in Syria. Listen to Obama, where he pledges that he's going to topple the Syrian government, the Assad government. Again, this was 14 years ago. 13 years ago. It's come to pass. No let up at all, everybody, on the Syrian people. Here's President Obama showing that it's not just a Republican thing, it's not just a Democratic thing, it's not a liberal thing, a conservative thing, it's an imperialist thing. Here's Obama.
At the same time, we're going to keep increasing the pressure on the Assad regime and working with the Syrian opposition. The Prime Minister has been at the forefront of the international effort to push for a transition to a democratic Syria without Bashar Assad.
That's the Turkish flag. He was meeting with Erdogan at the time. Erdogan is now the sponsor of HTS, formerly Al-Qaeda. As we go to the finish line here, Layan, I think we have to remember, all of us have to remember, that don't simply follow the U.S. mass media. Karl Marx said, and it's one of our favorite quotes that we use on this show, that the ideas of any society are the ideas of its ruling class, meaning it wants society, the ruling class wants the society to think as it does, to think the ruling class interests are our interests. Working class people have no investments in the Middle East. We don't have any bank investments. Most working class people in America can hardly make ends meet. But they want us to think like we're all on the same American team. So when you see the American media talking about how great it is in Syria that Assad has been overthrown, don't forget that there's a cynical manipulation of events going on by an imperialist ruling class. This war is a rich man's war, like the Libya war, like the Iraq war, like the Vietnam war, like the Korean war. These are wars that are motivated by imperialism. The Ukraine war, they're motivated by the interests of the ruling class. The ruling class would rather have Syrians killing Syrians or Ukrainians and Russians killing each other so that American troops don't die in large numbers, because in that case, the American working class will rise up, as it did during the Vietnam War. They want to have other kids, other people's kids doing all the fighting, but it's their war. It's a rich man's war. Again, the big issue is what's going to happen to the people of the Arab world and what's going to happen to the people of Palestine. At this moment, the Israelis have carried out devastating blows against people in Gaza, against people in Lebanon. Now they're doing it every day. I said in the beginning, 480 Israeli strikes against Syria just in the last 3 days since the Assad government's been gone. I feel it's our obligation for people living here in the center of imperialism to maintain this struggle, this independent struggle in solidarity with Palestine, with Lebanon, with the Syrian people. Those people will determine their own destiny, but our function must be to expose the machinations of imperialism, expose their lies, expose them for being who they really are. It seems to me that's our role here.
Absolutely, Brian. It's up to the people of the Arab region to determine the shape of their government, the shape of their society, and how they're going to carry that out. We need to make sure that we are explaining and that we are struggling against the U.S. and Israeli project for the region, because that has nothing to do with the self-determination of the Arab people. Israel has not only carried out strikes against Syria, they've occupied more territory of Syria. If you remember, a part of Syria has been occupied by the Israelis since 1967.
And it's annexed the Golan Heights.
The Golan Heights.
The whole Golan Heights in the last couple of days.
Over hundreds of villages completely destroyed. People are still living there in limbo for decades, not without Syrian state status, without Israeli citizenship. And now they've taken the rest of the Golan Heights region. They've occupied it. There's parts of Israeli society and government that are calling for the full annexation of more territory. They've reached Damascus. And nobody, the United States hasn't said anything, HTS hasn't said anything. Israel is not only striking, but occupying Syria. Israel has also violated the Lebanon ceasefire hundreds of times, Brian, since it came into effect on November 27, the same day that the rebel offensive began in Syria. Interesting timing, Brian. The day that the ceasefire goes into effect is when the process to topple the Syrian government begins.
That is interesting. You know, I'm glad you mentioned it. So Hezbollah signs an agreement to stop the bloodshed in Lebanon. So guns down for the moment. And that's when the HTS military initiative starts in Syria. Again, Layan, in our last 30 seconds or so, people have to keep organizing. They have to keep mobilizing. They have to keep showing solidarity with the people in Gaza. I think they will. I think we're in a new era. These are like momentous achievements by the Israeli military, striking at its enemies. At the same time, global opinion and U.S. public opinion has shifted.
Absolutely, Brian. We know that this agenda to so-called reshape the map of the Middle East to take down these 7 countries has been in operation for quite some time. The difference is, thanks to the steadfast resistance of the Palestinian people and their allies across the region, and also to the international movement and solidarity with the Palestinian cause, now this process of so-called reshaping the Middle East is happening in a context in which the entire world condemns it. Nobody now is saying anything good about Israel. I mean, the American population, the number one base for U.S. imperialism and Zionism, has completely turned its back. We've seen the impact of this over the past year. Mobilizations have been constant. They haven't stopped. They haven't stopped this month either. They've continued here in New York. We're going to have a major mobilization in New Jersey on the weekend on December 14. All New Yorkers are going to head down to New Jersey for a major mobilization. And we're planning all across the country on January 20th to come out in every city and town to protest not just Trump, but Trump's agenda, the billionaire agenda, which the billionaire agenda that backed the Democratic Party administrations as well, and that is benefiting not only from the exploitation of people here in this country, but by the genocidal projects of the U.S., of the White House across the Arab region. So we're going to be out in the streets very strong, and we're going to continue mobilizing and organizing against this agenda against the Arab peoples that is sponsored by any administration in the White House, Democrat or Republican. We've already seen how that's changed mass consciousness. It's changed the political arena over the past year, and there's a lot more to change going forward.
All right, so people can go to wefightback2025.org to learn about the January 20th demonstrations. Layan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Brian.